Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Paul Reubens? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, including the career and the crimes of Paul Reubens. Then I'll move to my analysis. Paul Reubenfeld was born on August 27, 1952, in Peekskill, New York. He grew up in Sarasota, Florida, and eventually went by the name Paul Reubens. His father, Milton, sold automobiles, and his mother was a teacher. His parents also owned a lamp store in Sarasota, Florida. Paul had a younger sister named Abby and a younger brother named Luke. When Paul was young, he was strongly influenced by the circus. He loved everything about it and was inspired to pursue a career in the entertainment business. His father built a stage when Paul was 5 years old, and Paul and his siblings would put on plays. Paul was active in theater during his time in high school. After graduation, he attended Boston University, but he was really interested in getting into an acting school. He was rejected by Carnegie Mellon University and the Juilliard School, but was eventually accepted by the California Institute of the Arts. Paul moved to California and worked as a salesman and in restaurants as he performed in local comedy clubs. He became a member of the Groundlings, which was an improvisational comedy team based in Los Angeles. Paul stayed there for 6 years, working with a number of entertainers who achieved various levels of fame. Paul became particularly good friends with Phil Hartman, who would go on to have massive success on Saturday Night Live and The Simpsons, before being murdered by his wife in 1998. In 1978, Paul Reubens developed the character that would make him famous, Pee Wee Herman. This character's first name came from a harmonica that Paul had owned, and the last name was from an energetic boy he knew as a child. Paul used an obnoxious, nasal, and frenetic voice for Pee Wee Herman. The idea was that this character was a completely untalented individual without any insight who desperately wanted to be a comedian. Put another way, he was trying to do for comedians what Kim Kardashian did for social media influencers. In 1980, Paul Reubens applied to become a cast member on Saturday Night Live, but Gilbert Gottfried was hired instead. Paul became furious, believing that the show was not recognizing his incredible talent. He decided to launch his own show in Los Angeles called The Pee Wee Herman Show. Phil Hartman and other friends of Paul helped him take his show to the Roxy Theater, where it performed quite well. The show was even on HBO in 1981 as part of a series they had featuring stand-up comedy routines. As Paul Reubens gained success, he attempted to keep the attention on his character, Pee Wee Herman. He wanted people to believe that Pee Wee Herman was a real comedian. There was no Paul Reubens. There was only Pee Wee Herman. When Paul would appear at various places, like on Late Night with David Letterman, he would always be in character as Pee Wee Herman. Warner Brothers contacted Paul to write a script for a movie based on Pee Wee Herman. The movie was titled Pee Wee's Big Adventure and was about a man searching for a stolen bicycle. It was produced for $7 million and released in 1985. The film received mixed reviews, but developed a cult following and was successful financially. Starting in 1986, Paul starred in a live-action children's show on CBS called Pee Wee's Playhouse. The show was supposed to be artistic, entertaining, and educational. Paul tried to make Pee Wee Herman into an ethical and positive role model for children. In 1988, Paul was featured in a sequel to Pee Wee's Big Adventure titled Big Top Pee Wee. It was not as successful as the original, but it still yielded a profit. In 1990, Pee Wee's Playhouse came to an end. Paul said that he was suffering from burnout and he wanted to work on other projects. In July 1991, Paul had a negative contact with law enforcement that would change his career forever. He was arrested in an adult movie theater in Sarasota, Florida. Paul had been watching two film classics, Nancy Nurse and Turn Up the Heat, when he was observed taking matters into his own hands, so to speak. Put another way, he was trying to transform the theater into Pee-wee's Playhouse. Being charged with indecent exposure would have made anyone look bad, but considering that Paul became famous playing a character who appealed to children, his reputation was devastated. Paul's life as an entertainer was severely limited, at least for a while, and he became an object of ridicule. Paul Reubens had always wanted to make a contribution to the world of comedy. This incident gave comedians something to talk about for many years to come. Several businesses desperately tried to remove any sign that they had ever been associated with Paul Reubens. CBS even canceled reruns of Pee-wee's Playhouse. In November 1991, Paul pleaded no contest to the charge. Under his plea agreement, he had to perform 75 hours of community service, but the charge would not appear on his permanent criminal record. The public was split as far as their opinions about Paul Reubens. He had a lot of support from Hollywood figures like Bill Cosby and Zsa Zsa Gabor. Some people said that he had committed a victimless crime, and Paul was the target of a puritanical society. Other people were more skeptical about Paul's nature and not quite as forgiving. They were worried that his behavior was part of a larger pattern of inappropriate desires. Paul stayed out of the spotlight for a while, although he did accept some small parts in movies, and had a recurring role on the TV series Murphy Brown from 1995 to 1997. In 2001, he was hired as the host of a game show, but it was canceled after 6 episodes because it was awful. In November of 2002, after many people had forgiven Paul and his career was picking up steam, he was arrested again, this time for possessing inappropriate images of minors. In March 2004, Paul was offered a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge of possession of obscene material. In exchange, the more serious charge was dismissed. For the next 3 years, Paul was not allowed to be in the company of minors without the permission of their parents or guardians, and he had to register his address with the sheriff's office. Paul had managed to escape the most severe consequences of his behavior, and amazingly, his arrest did not impair his career as much as the first one did. Paul would later claim that he simply had a vast collection of vintage photographs, and the state was being judgmental. Critics of Paul pointed to this incident as confirming their earlier concerns about a pattern of destructive behavior, but Hollywood kept casting Paul in various shows. There was the sense that his Hollywood supporters, in particular, did not want to admit that they may have been wrong about Paul Reubens. In 2010, Paul brought the Pee Wee Herman show to Broadway and had a great deal of success. He was excited to introduce the character to a new generation. In 2016, Paul was featured in a Netflix movie titled Pee-wee's Big Holiday. The next year, Paul was diagnosed with cancer. He died in a hospital in Los Angeles on July 30, 2023. Paul Reubens was 70 years old. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. Paul Reubens' creation, Pee Wee Herman, is a character who resonates with some people and irritates others. Paul developed the persona to represent a comedian without insight, a man who could not understand how the world perceived him. Pee Wee Herman was trapped in a never-ending cycle of clumsiness and uncomfortable situations. His squeaky voice and bizarre mannerisms attracted both positive and negative attention. One could argue that Pee Wee Herman was really a clown, which makes sense based on where Paul gained inspiration. Paul felt like an oddball, so he created a socially awkward character who would never hide behind normal behavior. In a sense, Pee Wee Herman was authentic. He could always be his true self, not bound by the rules of etiquette or common sense. The corny and cartoonish behavior of Pee Wee Herman allowed audiences to celebrate childhood experiences. Pee Wee Herman would never truly mature, and his childlike persona connected with both children and adults. He acted like a child, which children liked, and he was an adult who refused to grow up, which some adults enjoyed. The Pee Wee Herman character was novel, catchy, and amazingly successful. Some people, however, suspected there was a darker side to this cheerful character. They were suspicious of the man behind Pee Wee Herman. This brings me to item number 2. Paul Reubens had a dark side and appeared to be facing demons in his life. He was arrested in 1991 and pleaded no contest. He was arrested in 2002 and pleaded guilty. One could argue that 2 arrests are insufficient to establish a pattern of behavior, but Paul was also arrested 20 years before his famous self-service performance. He was picked up in 1971 in Sarasota, Florida, for loitering and prowling near an adult theater. The charges were ultimately dismissed. Paul was also arrested in 1983 for possession of marijuana. He received 2 years of probation. Even if someone were inclined to give him a pass for the 1983 arrest, because attitudes on marijuana have changed, Paul was arrested 3 times in his life for crimes that were in some way related to sexual behavior. Given the location of the 1971 arrest, one would think that Paul would have been a lot more careful about what he did in or near adult theaters. Paul Reubens was enjoying incredible success in 1991. It was a golden age for him, yet he was willing to throw away all his good fortune in order to surrender to his impulses. After his 1991 arrest, Paul made 2 mistakes which indicated his state of mind and his view of morality. He tried to bribe the police by offering to perform a children's benefit as Pee Wee Herman, and attempted to do the same thing with a reporter in order to prevent the story from being published. Paul did not understand that the police had already seen enough of his performances to last a lifetime. He was trying to escape responsibility for his behavior through bribery, but he also claimed that the police were mistaken. He denied any responsibility whatsoever. This pattern repeated after his 2002 arrest. He pleaded guilty in that case, but then later accused the state of being judgmental about his collection of images. He argued that his collection represented historical art. The state made it clear that Paul's art collection was far from innocent. As far as Paul Reubens was concerned, all of his problems were someone else's fault. He had the worst luck in the world around police officers. They just kept arresting him for no reason. It is reasonable to believe that Paul's arrests were indicative of a larger pattern of behavior. Item number 3, Paul never seemed to appreciate how much he disappointed his fans. Through his repeated denial of responsibility, he cheated himself out of the possibility of meaningful redemption. Paul denied his true nature. He was unwilling to face his desires and worked to change them. Referring to his career, Paul once said, quote, "I wrecked it to some degree. I got made into something different," unquote. He suggested that the shine had been removed. In addition to not making the best word selection, Paul once again refused to own his behavior. I think many people were ready to forgive Paul, but he wasn't ready to accept reality. There was the sense with Paul Reubens that he viewed all his own behavior as beyond his control. He was a victim, and by making him a victim, the world had lost some of the innocence and greatness of Pee Wee Herman. For example, when talking about the legacy of his character, Paul said, quote, "This can't be my final thing. I'm a big believer in the happy ending. I want Pee Wee to have a happy ending," unquote. Paul really did have a talent for picking the wrong words. Item number 4, what should the legacy of Paul Reubens look like? This is just a theory, my opinion. I think that Paul Reubens was a troubled man who could not take an honest look at himself. Despite this, he had a tremendous level of success and entertained millions of people. Paul made this colorful and annoying character Pee Wee Herman to create a perfect example of purity and gullibility, a hapless character who does not possess ill intent. Paul Reubens wanted to become Pee Wee Herman in order to escape his real identity. Pee Wee Herman was not only a container of social awkwardness, but a place of safety for Paul Reubens, a way to escape his true self, a way to become something good and wholesome, an instrument of happiness through which Paul Reubens could safely express himself. Paul was unable to accept responsibility for his behavior, but he desperately wanted absolution. The problem was he wanted it on his own terms. After being arrested in 2002, his 4th arrest, Paul wanted to know what constituted art. he was trying to make a defense of the images that he had. But one could look at this question from another perspective. One could argue that Pee Wee Herman was an art form, not only a clownish figure to entertain, but a positive character designed to resist bad intentions. Maybe the greatest art form that Paul created has been misunderstood. Pee Wee Herman was a reflection of a complex man, a character who is able to put on a bow tie and a smile while keeping a lid on a circus full of demons. Pee Wee Herman was a metaphor for Paul's unwillingness to grow up. The character walked a tightrope between competing forces and functioned to keep Paul's desires under the big top. Those are my thoughts on the case of Paul Reubens. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.